Folks, welcome. Following from our last video, as promised, we'll be going over the Warlock 16 Grimrail. We are running a little bit behind in videos at the moment, and that is because I have a special project essentially in the works for tomorrow, which we'll discuss at the end of the video, so please do stay tuned for that. Without any further delay though, let's get into the key. So then, much like the Paladin's 16 key, it was a fortified Sanguine Grievous, and we're just going to go straight into it. I've already started the key, I've summoned my Felguard, and I've taken haste. I am running Grim Inquisitors rather than Implosion for this dungeon. So let's get the play-by-play and go into it. So already one advantageous difference between being ranged and melee at the moment is I don't have any positional requirements where I might end up cleaving something like the Overseer or the Infiltrator as it runs into the pack and taking aggro. My pet does that, and there will be points during the dungeon where my pet ends up taking damage, but at least in this dungeon I don't recall any immediate having to resummon my pet during the encounter space. So we're running with a Beast Mastery Hunter, Elemental Shaman, Restore Shaman, and a Guardian Druid. Fairly easy key, not too much, and we don't actually have any other melee that could cause a problem for our tank. Now, one observational thing for me personally that I need to bear in mind is, and it's been commented a couple of times, is my Hand of Gul'dan usage could be a little bit better. I do have a habit of trying to fish for demonic core procs when I have nothing else to do, rather than casting Shadow Bolts. So, little challenge for you guys. Count how many sub 2 or sub 3 shard Hand of Gul'dans I cast, and we will try in future keys to start minimizing that number. Because although it's not necessarily Mythic Plus related, we have quite a bit of ways to go if we're going to improve and earn our spot in our guild, because although we have Cutting Edge, we are still on trial. So we have a bit of work to do. Now, Demonic Tyrant usage so far is pretty good, but there does come a point where, as you're going through this chain of packs, if you're doing it quite slowly, you can end up in a situation where your Tyrant comes off cooldown about midway through the next pack, which causes a bit of a problem when it comes in terms of whether or not you want to use Tyrant on boss. But I don't think in this dungeon it was a problem, and we're getting through this at a nice clip. I'm doing a reasonable amount of damage. So far we're averaging 19k, which ain't too shabby, to be honest. I am playing Demonology, obviously, over Destruction, but this is a personal preference thing with the nerfs to Destruction, although Destruction is still perfectly viable, and arguably still best. From a pugging perspective, I prefer the consistency that Demonology provides over the potential strengths of Destruction. Because you got to remember, Destruction is very tank heavy in that if your tank doesn't pull enough or doesn't have fast enough pacing, you're not going to get the benefits out of Destruction that you would otherwise see. These early packs are also a good argument to have something like Implosion if you wanted to run them, but with it being, or with the bosses being as they are, Implosion isn't that beneficial as we go through them. Because Rocket Spark and Borka, 2-target fight, so you don't get the benefit of Implosion there. Nitrog Thunder Tower, you would get the benefit from Implosion for the most part there due to the ad spawns, but not at the start of the encounter space, and you're kind of relying on the rocket launchers anyway, so that can kind of mow through a lot of the targets. We're holding Bloodlust for the point where we knock Rocket Spark down, so Tyrant's not as powerful as it should be, but it still does alright. Now, we do end up losing a chamois there that anks, and with these imps, what I should probably have done when Borka was by Rocket Spark is probably make use of Implode rather than them tying out. Because, as you can see there, I do eventually implode, but I lost a considerable amount of imps, so rather than having 15-16 imps, I only had 5 or 6 to play with for the implosion. Now, from a rotational point of view, probably should have cast dogs before trying to finish the Hand of Gul'dan cast, and prioritized getting dogs out. Because that's another key thing from my damage perspective. It's only going to net me a couple, like 0.5% of maybe of damage overall over the course of things like fights and the dungeon, but I'm starting to get to that stage now in my personal progression where that 0.5% is the biggest upgrade I can make outside of, you know, RNG gear. Like, I still need the Mechagon rings, for instance. Now, I'll be ashamed to say that there I did a little bit of keyboard turning, kind of because I was getting lazy at this point, because I remember running this dungeon rather late at night, like it's 10 past 11 on an evening, my time, which means for the server in Europe it was well gone midnight. So, a little bit tired and a little bit lazy. But, one thing to bear in mind, obviously, with Borka as well, another thing is the slams do silence you, so you need to bear that in mind, and it's something that I should have paid more attention to. Now, we're quite fortunate here in that we have 20 imps, which I immediately implode into Zolgamox and the Infiltrator. Probably not the best use of the implosion overall. Might have been a little bit better had the bat actually been on the tank, or if we'd stacked closer. But the problem with having a full range group like this is the fact that the bat is always going to spawn out. Thankfully, however, due to the timings between them, you have both the hunter and myself that are able to fully manage the bat completely. So you saw that my axe toss came out. Still, actually, that's a point rewatching this. I need to macro a mouse over for axe toss, because that will infinitely speed up the fight. Mortal, that was a fear, rather than the standard mortal coil. But thankfully, with the nerfs to Zolgamox goes down fairly easily. Now, I cast a 6-stack Tyrant. Zolgamox is nearly dead, so it's not huge, but by extending the imps, it means that hopefully going up this ramp bit, which can be problematic for casters, because again, this depends on how the tank is going to tank them, but we can immediately send them in. So what I should have done is I should have sent dogs in first before getting further casts off, and I'm not entirely sure who died there, but obviously required a combat res. It was the shaman. But it's fine. So we've got the imps. Now, interesting thing from a line of sight perspective, if you angle your camera properly, you can actually fight Z-axis and basically fight up the ramps. So I could actually be parked like down here and still hit the bombardier. Now, that's only really needed if your tank is trying to essentially double tank both mobs at the gate, because you can then stand away from anywhere that the bombardier is throwing things and generally be safe, which is much more preferable than when you're melee and you're having to kind of be up there and possibly risk having the bombardier above you throw things down while you're fighting the second one. So, a little bit of a tank strategy. If you've got a range group, you can take them one at a time, because they don't really pose too much of a threat. But if you have a melee, realistically, you need to pull them both up and fight them together. Obviously, as you saw, if you have watched the 16 paladin POV of this, if a tank does do that, they need to be ready to have aggro on both, because a melee DPS can and will rip aggro off you. So, something to bear in mind. Now, unfortunately, this is another problem with Grimrail Depot. You can kind of see just how limited we are in terms of angle space for standing on stuff. Like, I am currently standing next to a box. I could probably try and jump up on the boxes slightly to stay out of things. I was very, very lucky there in not getting slapped. But, unfortunately, this section of Grimrail is very compact. And is one of the few perks of having a full range group, is the tank has that space to maneuver without necessarily pulling things onto a melee DPS and the melee DPS getting cleaved by something. But at the same time, you have line of sight problems. So you can see that all those ranged DPS are penned into this very, very tight corner in order to see. Now, an interesting choice here is I unending resolved the start of this pack, and the reason for that is because I can't remember which one it is. I don't know if it's the Cinderseer or the Grenadier, but they can put a very, very long silence onto you that lasts about 10 seconds, and I don't know if it expires due to you taking so much damage or you having to move out of a zone. I've never quite managed to work it out before the time's elapsed or I've realised I've been silenced in previous encounters. So as a Warlock, Unending Resolve makes you immune to silences and interrupts. So for this pack at least, just pre-walling and making it so that I'm not going to suffer that problem, I can get most of my rotation out. That was an unfortunate sleep, which meant that we were kind of wasting a bit of time, but all in all, not too shabby. And again, another sleep straight into a sanguine puddle, which kind of sucks, but we get cookies up because I am burning through my cookies. And then we have a 9-stack Tyrant, which is nice. We go up to 14. Now, what I probably should have done at this point, rather than sidestepping, is I should have imploded immediately first, then started positioning. Now, Hand of Gul'dan, that was a low stack Hand of Gul'dan, shouldn't have done that, but we got the dogs out and then went into an implode. So you can see that we're doing a good amount of damage. Like, we're doing 50k, which is pretty good. But it could be better. Like, we could probably have got that to 55k-ish if I'd imploded more efficiently, for want of a better term. Now, this carriage is a problem because this is one of those carriages where if your ranged aren't particularly good with their cameras, you can also accidentally pull this middle pack because there's no depth perception when you're trying to look through this top area of the carriage to see these nameplates. Now, where I'm stood is far enough back that I'm not likely to get caught by any knockbacks, like my paladin was in the 16 that we did. But it does leave me very limited for space strafing side to side to avoid mechanics, which is why you see me get slept there. Now, this is one problem with ranged that some melee probably don't realise. Especially if you have someone like a shaman with you and you're putting these ground effects down to be static, whether it be Rune of Power, Soul Rot with Decaying Soul Satchel, and Dreamweaver's Field of Blossoms. There is no way in hell, if you're tunnel visioning on the Hulk, that you're going to see that the sleep pool, you can see just half of it at the moment, is actually strafing towards us. Now, there are some cases, because like I'm now stood in a sanguine puddle, which I couldn't see until I stepped in and my character turned red. Now, there are some other dungeons, like Karazhan, for example, specifically Lower Karazhan, where there's stuff on the floor already, like carpet as you're going towards the Maiden of Virtue. They will completely hide the sleep puddles. So you have to try and not stand on them, because you may just randomly be slept. So things can get a bit clustered, especially when you've got shamans. But maybe that's a graphics setting on my end. Slight positioning error in terms of keeping that ad because of sanguine. But it can't really be helped. As you can see, areas do get very, very tight. Now, this is where it really becomes a bit of a cluster. Being stood in a corner, you've got all your imps out, you've got a Tauren standing on me. There's not really a lot I can see at the moment due to my camera angle. The only benefit for having this camera angle is you can see the limits of the red circles, the barrages that he throws out. And that's kind of the key thing that you need to avoid, this black mortar, and the barrage gets sent in a line away from him. Now, again, remember this pillar isn't exactly as safe as one might think, so stand where you are with Skull and you're perfectly fine. Now, we have a lot of imps here, and this would be, or would have been, an ideal setting had we had something like Air Mass Grip, something with the DK, because we still have 2 infantrymen running in from the other side that I haven't been able to damage. So that 26 imp implosion could have been much nicer, but unfortunately, we're not exactly in a group that has those chains. But not too shabby. Now we've got the mortar shells. I soul rot to get here. Now, you don't necessarily have to be in this far cannon. I just choose to be there for a ease of aiming, I guess. But you can use this middle cannon and still hit him. You just have to aim on the right hand side of this pillar, so you end up catching kind of like this region here above my bar. By the way, as a side note, this particular bar is a cosmetic change from a weak aura, taking bigwigs and stuff like that and converting it into this bar. So you have your 5-second line here and it counts down. Personal preference, just in case anyone was wondering why my bar looks like that. So this fight, for those of you that don't know, has 2 types of ammunition. You have the mortars, which damage the boss, and you then have the shrapnel that trashes the trash. Now, here obviously I then stand in the correct spot and don't get clobbered. But again, just to remind people, you can see the splash damage come through the pillar. So you need to be wary of that. Not the greatest fight for Demonology, but thankfully, cannon damage works. So I have 4 shots of the shrapnel. If the tank was to have the mobs closer to that middle cannon, you can actually damage Thunder Tower through it. However, I opt for a 10-stack Tyrant and we just do damn. Now, I do try to pick up some of the shrapnel and I'm going to show you here. So hopefully he's within range and we're going to channel the ability, and you can see that I'm doing damage. I'm doing 82,000 damage per shot, essentially per tick, while keeping Thunder Tower within range of this cannon. So if you're a tank, bear this in mind, and DPS as well, make sure you pick up anything you can. If you get the mortar, hit him while he's in the cannon, and if you get the shrapnel, make use of it here, because it will also clear trash. So you can speed up Thunder Tower to be a much, much quicker fight. It also, from a DPS perspective, massively inflates your damage. Like I did 33k damage, and I did more damage than pretty much the rest of the group combined. So this is unfortunate and is likely to see me potted, because that is just atrocious. Ticks for 1,000 a second and just absolutely mullers you. So like I couldn't do anything there to live, which sucks, but Not really too much you can say, honestly. It's just one of those things where you have to, you essentially have to ensure that you wait until you can get across without the fire. Unfortunately, there's no like predicted textures for it where it would show you where it is, but eh. Now, because this is a group pug, and just it was a weekly key, one thing that probably should have been done is I should have received a combat res, because you can see here that I'm not actually getting resed at all. The group just goes, and we had a combat res spare, but the druid just didn't bother. Nor did the druid particularly bother to wait for me to get resed, which is a little bit problematic, purely from the perspective of the group would die, like the group that they are now currently fighting would die faster if I was present. And there's no way really to get around that fact when you consider throughout the rest of the dungeon I've consistently been either doing well above the next person in terms of damage, the instances where we were doing like 50k, or I'm second pulling, 19, 20k DPS. And you can see that they're still fighting the mobs and they're only at half health. So you've got the scout, you've got the captain, you've got a couple of loaders, and you've got a seer that's still at full health. So not entirely sure what's happened, and what by doing so it also puts us in this really awkward position of where we end up using Tyrant or not. Like, do we hold Tyrant now for the boss? Now in this setting, I deciding whether or not to do this. And one personal thing as well is I needed, like, I've not used dogs at all, which is a really, really bad thing to do, because I eventually used dogs at like a 30 stack dogs. I shouldn't have done that. But this is a byproduct of me joining the fight late and then trying to essentially work out what I should do. Because I could have used Tyrant to deal with the Seer much earlier on, because thanks to Sanguine, the Scout's back at full health. And we still have those other packs to deal with, and yet, due to me trying to essentially assess the criteria, we eventually get into this position where I just go, fuck it, I have to use Tyrant, despite the fact that I should have used Tyrant 30 seconds ago. And had I used it 30 seconds ago, rather than it now being a minute and a half cooldown, it'd be on its, minute, maybe 40 seconds-ish, so that then it's ready for when the boss arrives. And this whole spiraling effect is because the tank didn't give the healer enough time to single target res me, or more accurately, I wasn't combat resed. Because the druid could have combat resed me without a problem, and we would have continued fighting the seer. Alternatively, the healer, had they used a single target heal rather than a mass res, because a lot of healers rely on mass resurrection. Now, just pausing it for a second while we talk about mass resurrection. A lot of healers just rely on mass res as the button to use. However, mass resurrection has the problem in that if a member of your party ends up going into combat, it cancels your mass res. Single target resurrection, on the other hand, doesn't do that. So your tank can continue chain pulling while you cast res on a single target, which is what our healer should have done if the druid wasn't going to combat res. But either which way, the pack went down, we managed to sort it. But what it does mean is we are now 30 seconds out of using Tyrant, and Bloodlust has been popped. Which isn't great, honestly. Now, we'll just go back 10 seconds. Strafe slightly. Because in my Paladin's video, I said I stood on the bar. However, that's actually incorrect for this video. The Shaman is stood here, which means that had this electric charge been going through here, one of our Shamans wouldn't have had to move. My positioning was a bit meh, because I'd set the gateway across, just on the off chance I needed to get far. Now, the only benefit of me having essentially not used Tyrant on the Bloodlust is because when everyone else is dying down in terms of their total damage, because you can see that everyone's starting to dip off now, I'm about to ramp up. Now, that was a very, very lucky extension on the dogs. Like, it was just about to expire, so we were quite fortunate there. So we were able to pick up the pace in terms of our damage. Now you can see that I'm stood on the bar here, which means that in theory, I shouldn't have to move again. So that was a panic circle and wasn't actually needed, because again, if we go back 10 seconds, you'll see my health just went back up and I don't have a heal on me. So if we go further, again, my health hasn't moved, it's actually just increased. But because I demonic circled, I then had to move position. So this lightning is essentially Z-axis. And because these beams are slightly lower, you don't seem to take damage from them. The only problem is you have to contend with the traps. Oh yeah. That is the 16 Grimrail depot from the Warlock's perspective, rather than the Paladins. As you can see, my Warlock had a much easier time of it. It was obviously in time as well, as a result, and my Warlock was able to do significantly more damage as a byproduct of that. Now, because of this special project that I have in mind for tomorrow, we are a little bit behind on videos. And for those of you that have stayed to the end to see this, or are wondering what that special project is, I also play Destiny 2. Now, Destiny 2 has gone into its new season, Season 18, which is the Season of Plunder. I won't bore you with all of those details. However, there is a new raid, or a raid being re-released from Destiny 1 called King's Fall. And that is released tomorrow, so Friday the 26th. And when the servers reset, I will be taking part with my clan in the 24-hour challenge. So I'm going to be streaming it. So Twitch is getting dusted off and we're going to attempt streaming. But we're going to stream the entire challenge. And that challenge is completing the raid within the first 24 hours of its release, which is something I've never done before and is something I've had to prep for over the last few days, because I'm more of a casual Destiny 2 player rather than a hardcore player. But as a byproduct of that, it has kind of shifted things around. So hopefully you guys will join me on Twitch tomorrow evening, or tomorrow afternoon if you're in the US, for the 24-hour challenge. And I will release my Paladin's next Mythic Plus video over the weekend once things have settled down after the Destiny window. In the meantime, though, I hope you all have a wonderful day, wherever you are in the world, and I will catch you all in the next one. See you later, and take care.